Dear students, welcome to this program. In today's lecture, we are going to discuss Indian national movements, growth of national consciousness. The formulated objectives which we are going to accomplish in this topic are to know about the various national movements during the British rule, to understand the British policies in India, to evaluate the British system with respect to economy, agriculture, education and press, to analyze the factors responsible for emergence of national consciousness among Indians, and lastly to review the response of Indians to British exploitation. First, introduction. Dear students, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru wrote, quote, "There were two worlds, the world of British officials and the world of India's millions, and there was nothing in common between them except a common dislike for each other." Unquote. The emergence of national consciousness among Indians during 19th century was the direct outcome of British rule. India was being exploited as a British colony. This process of colonization brought about economic, political and social changes in India. These changes resulted in oppression of Indians and gave rise to widespread dissatisfaction among all Indian classes. Moreover, the development of post-telegraph, railways, printing press and educational institutions contributed to the growing nationalism. Though British developed post-telegraph, railways, printing press and educational institutions for their own benefit and effective administration, they became instrumental in rise and growth of national consciousness. Collapse of Indian agriculture. The Indian agriculture and handicraft industry was completely destroyed by the economic policies adopted by the British. Farmers, artisans and other economic classes were deeply affected. British agriculture policies just aimed to collect maximum revenue from the peasants. Zamindari system was established at the permanent settlements, and here zamindar was responsible to collect the land revenue and pay to the state. Though the land revenue was fixed for zamindars, they used to charge more from the peasants than what they had to pay to the state. Consequently, large number of farmers were just reduced to landless laborers. Next, destruction of Indian industry. Artisans also faced hardships due to the restrictions imposed on import of Indian textiles in Britain, whereas machine-made goods from Britain were brought to India without any taxes. Moreover, Indian artisans could not compete with machine-made goods of Britain. The workers of factories, mines and plantations were paid very low wages and they had to live in extreme poverty. The policies relating to trade, tariff, taxation and transport also affected the new upcoming industries in India. Indian capitalists were ignored in comparison to the British capitalists who wanted to establish any industries in India. Consequently, India was just used as the source of raw material for British industries. Next, factors helping emergence of national consciousness. Some factors which contributed in the growth of national consciousness in India are administrative system. For a better exploitation of the Indian resources, the British brought large parts of the country under a uniform system of administration. Land, revenue administration, police, law and order machinery and judicial system were some of the important measures adopted for bringing about this uniformity in administration. Education system. British introduced a system of education which was Western both in method and material. The main idea behind establishment of the new education system was the creation of British loyal Indians. To put it in the words of Macaulay, the idea was to form a class of persons, Indians in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinion, in morals and in intellect. But this education system also familiarized educated Indians with ideas of equality, liberty and nationalism. British expansion policy. British initially conquered kings who were against them and established their rule in different areas. This expansion policy continued even with the rulers who were not at war with them. This made Indian rulers frightened and worried about the British. Thoughts of the intellectuals. Modern education also paved way for the rise of intellectuals. These intellectuals had critical and creative thoughts about the contemporary society. They strongly aimed at transforming this contemporary society along the modern lines. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Rajaram Mohan Roy, Ranade, Keshav Chandra Sen were a few intellectuals who contributed to the emergence and rise of national consciousness. Development of means of transport and communication. The British rulers established a wide network of roads and railways to promote their commercial interests and maintain a rigid administrative control over India. The railways proved to be a blessing for the country in as much as its various parts separated by rivers, hills and mountains were connected with one another and brought closer together. Lines of communication knit together the vast country and its geographical unity became a tangible reality. It enabled educated Indians living in different parts of the country to come in contact with one another and discuss the problems facing the country as a whole. Development of roads and railways made it possible to mobilize public opinion on a national scale. Western education. The British rulers introduced the teaching of the English language in schools and colleges to get a regular supply of clerks and babus to work in the administrative offices established by them. Knowledge of English proved to be a boon as the young men educated through the English medium were introduced to the liberal ideas of the West, such as freedom, democracy, and nationalism. In the words of Lord Ronald, quote, "The new wine of Western learning went into the heads of the young Indians. They drank deep from the source of liberty and nationalism. Their whole outlook underwent a revolution influenced by these national and democratic ideas. Indian intelligentsia looked to the problems facing the country from an all-India angle." Unquote. English proved to be a link language through which people living in widely separated regions began to communicate. It became a lingua franca of the country. Official and business correspondence began to be conducted through English. Naturally, the first leaders of the national movement were those young men who had acquired an English education. Next, economic exploitation. With the establishment of British rule in India, the country's economy was crippled. Indian handicrafts began to die out. India, which had won worldwide fame as an exporter of fine cloth, was turned into an importer of machine-made cloth and other factory goods from England. Millions of craftsmen and artisans were thrown out of employment, resulting in poverty everywhere. With this change in the pattern of trade, every class of Indian society was adversely affected. Lord Salisbury, the Secretary of State, aptly said, quote, "The British rule was bleeding India white." Unquote. The net result of this exploitation was that the average income of an Indian fell below the level of subsistence. There were repeated famines which caused untold havoc. Each famine was followed by an epidemic which took a heavy toll of life. Ruthless exploitation of the country's resources made them miserable and brought about dissatisfaction and resentment against an alien regime. Racial pride of the British rulers. The British rulers considered themselves to be racially superior to Indians and were proud of their complexion, blood, and culture. They looked down upon Indians as uncivilized and dubbed them as black people and hated to mix with them. Indians were not allowed to travel in the same railway compartments in which Englishmen travelled and were debarred from going to clubs and hotels visited by Englishmen. The Arms Act of Lord Lytton declared keeping of arms without license a crime, but the Europeans were made an exception. This discriminatory act angered the Indians. Surendranath Banerjee aptly remarked, quote, "The Arms Act imposed on us a badge of racial inferiority." Unquote. In the matter of justice, Europeans were given preferential treatment, while Englishmen were let off or lightly punished even for murders and brutalities committed by them. Indians were severely punished for minor offences. Discrimination in services. In the early years of British rule in India, all important positions in the administration and army were held by Englishmen. Indians were distrusted and not assigned any position of trust and responsibility. In the later part of British rule, some Indians were given posts in lower grades in the services, but preference for higher service was always given to men of British origin. A general notion prevailed among the British that Indians, howsoever qualified they might be, were inferior to Englishmen. Indians were mocked at as drawers of water and hewers of wood. The Charter Act of 1833 and Queen Victoria's Proclamation of 1858 had promised equality of opportunity in employment, but these well-intentioned pronouncements were never translated into action. S.N. Banerjee rightly remarked, quote, "No self-respecting Indian could sit idle under the fierce light of that revolution. It was a call to that high patriotic duty of those who understood its significance." Unquote. Now, reform movements. The second half of the 19th century was a period of Indian awakening and reformation. The Brahmo Samaj, the Ramakrishna Mission, the Arya Samaj, the Theosophical Society, and many socio-religious movements not only fought against social evils but also generated confidence and national pride in the people who had sunk down to the lowest level of social and moral degradation. These movements reminded the people of excellence and greatness of their cultural heritage. Swami Vivekananda, Swami Dayanand Saraswati, Annie Besant, Mahadev Govind Ranade, and many other social reformers aroused in them an urge for freedom. Swami Dayanand Saraswati, the founder of the Arya Samaj, gave the slogan, "India for the Indians." Then the vernacular press. The vernacular press was the chief instrument through which the nationalists spread the message of patriotism and modern economic, social, and political ideas and created an all India consciousness. During the second half of the 19th century, a number of newspapers, journals, magazines, and books appeared in Indian languages which criticized British administration and pointed out its defects. In 1877, there were as many as 62 newspapers appearing in Indian languages. The Vernacular Press Act of Lord Lytton in 1878 laid down that the editors of the vernacular newspapers were to sign a bond to publish nothing that would create feelings of dissatisfaction against the government, but the English language press was kept outside its purview. This discriminatory and repressive measure of Lord Lytton inflamed the feelings of bitterness among the Indians against the British. The Vernacular Press Act was withdrawn by Lord Ripon in 1882. Steadily and silently, Indian newspapers infused a spirit of patriotism and nationalism in the people and provided a direction to the national struggle for emancipation. Many Indian writers brought out books based on patriotism. Bankim Chandra's famous book Anand Math, the Bible of the modern Bengali patriotism, provided very great inspiration to the people. Vande Mataram, the national song of India, was adopted from this very book. Rabindranath Tagore in Bengali, Lakshminath Bezbarwa in Assamese, Vishnu Shastri Chiplankar in Marathi, Subramanya Bharti in Tamil, Bhartendu Harishchandra in Hindi, and Altaf Hussain Holi in Urdu were some of the nationalist writers of this period. Now, let us see how intellectual awakening took place. 19th century India is marked by a process of social reform and intellectual ferment. Raja Ram Mohan Rai, Keshab Chandra Sen, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Ranade, and Sir Syed Ahmad Khan were among the leading intellectuals of the 19th century who contributed to the awakening of national consciousness. The British, in order to provide a justification for foreign rule, had tried to project the immediate pre-British period, 18th century, as a period of stagnation. Along with this, they tried to establish that Indians had no achievements to their credit in the field of science and technology and were incapable of providing a proper government. The educated Indians countered this thesis by bringing to light the achievements of Indians in art, architecture, literature, philosophy, and science. Now, reaction of Indians to British exploitation. Since the beginning of the British rule, the oppressed Indians showed resistance to the policies adopted by the British. This resistance gradually took the form of a national movement. 19th century saw numerous uprisings of peasants and tribal people. Though in modern sense these were not actual conscious national uprisings, they contributed to the overall national consciousness. Peasant revolts were less violent compared to the revolts of the tribal people. The list of few peasant and tribal revolts of early 19th century is Travancore Revolt 1800–1809, Bill Revolt 1818 to 1831, Ho Revolt 1820–1821, Khasi Revolt 1829 to 1831, Wahhabi Movement 1830 to 1869, Coal Revolt 1831, Farazi Movement 1834 to 1847, Santhal Revolt 1855 to 1856. The Indian resistance may broadly be divided into two forms: one, the peasants and tribal movements, and second, the middle class opposition. The peasant and tribal movements. In the 19th century, we come across a number of peasant and tribal uprisings. The early uprisings were not consciously nationalist uprisings, but in due course this contributed to the emergence of nationalist consciousness. To begin with, these peasant and tribal revolts were organized against the British oppressive policies. These revolts were predominantly of a lower class social character. Regarding the tribal movements, K. Suresh Singh in his study of the tribals says that they revolted more often and far more violently than any other community, including peasants in India. These revolts cannot be called the conscious nationalist movements in the modern sense. The most important factor behind all these movements was a combined protest against British policies. At times, these were also sparked off by some oppressive policies of a zamindar, moneylender, or an administrative officer. Now, revolt of 1857. The feelings of discontent and dissatisfaction with the British rule gave rise to the revolt of 1857. The revolt spread to most of the northern and central India. The revolt was ruthlessly suppressed and the British government took the control of India from the East India Company into its own hands. Even after the suppression of this major revolt, popular uprisings in India continued throughout the 19th century. Next, peasant movements after 1857. The important movements in the second half of the 19th century were Indigo Revolt 1859 to 60 in Bengal, Kuki Revolt 1860 to 90 in Tripura, Kukka Revolt 1869 to 72 in Punjab, Pabna Peasant Movement 1872-73 in Bengal, Vasudev Balwant Phadke's Revolt 1879 in Maharashtra, and Birsa Munda's Revolt 1899 to 1900 in South Bihar. Thus, we notice that throughout the 19th century, Indian masses were struggling against the British rule. Now, middle class consciousness. During the 19th century, apart from popular uprisings and revolts at the mass level, a new consciousness was developing in the educated sections and middle class. It was this middle class consciousness which became the chief medium for the channelization of popular discontent and was instrumental in the development of national consciousness in India. The educated classes began to critically examine the Indian society, and the awakened sections made all-out efforts for reforms. Raja Ram Mohan Rai established Brahmo Samaj to fight social evils. Dayanand Saraswati formed the Arya Samaj. Vivekananda established Ramakrishna Mission. A number of other organizations were formed for doing away with the social evils like sati, untouchability, rituals, etc. These reform movements, though confined in a large part to the middle class sections, developed a national social consciousness among Indian people and deepened their sense of belonging to a common culture. The middle class worked in two ways. One, they started writing books, articles, and publishing newspapers to critically analyze the British policies and developing consciousness among the masses. The second method adopted by the middle classes was to form organizations, associations, and societies for joint programs and activities. After the takeover of India's administration by the British Crown in 1858, new hopes kindled among the Indian middle classes. They thought that the British government would stop the economic exploitation and work for the welfare of the country. Soon they realized that the British Crown too was out to exploit India economically. Now the political activities increased and a number of new organizations appeared. In England was formed London India Association, which was later merged with the East India Association in 1866. In Maharashtra, Pounasvarjanik Sabha 1870 and Indian Association 1876 were formed. In Bengal, Indian National Conference 1883 and in Madras, Mahajan Sabha were formed. As compared to the earlier organizations formed by middle class elements, these organizations were political. Their main aim was to protest against the British policies through petitions and resolutions. They tried to achieve mass awakening through public meetings and statements. They also exchanged views on the national issues. Actually, these organizations opened the way for the formation of a strong all India organization, Indian National Congress, in 1885. Around the same time, the British government passed some repressive measures like Lincoln Act, Vernacular Press Act, lowering the age of Indian civil services, etc. The reaction to these measures was very strong. Now students, let us conclude that the process of colonization by the British brought about economic, political and social changes in India. These changes resulted in oppression of Indians and gave rise to widespread dissatisfaction among people of India. However, the development of post, telegraph, railways, printing press and educational institutions contributed to the growing nationalism. The second half of the 19th century was a period of Indian awakening and reformation. The Brahmo Samaj, the Ramakrishna Mission, the Arya Samaj, the Theosophical Society and many socio-religious movements not only fought against social evils but also generated confidence and national pride in the people who had sunk down to the lowest level of social and moral degradation. These moments reminded the people of the excellence and greatness of their cultural heritage. Swami Vivekananda, Swami Dayanand Saraswati, Annie Besant, Mahadev Govind Ranade and many other social reformers aroused in them an urge for freedom. With this, we complete our today's lecture. Thank you.